This is the age of fake news. Distrust of the media has never been higher. There aren't necessarily bad reasons for that. We've all seen the press skewing things to suit a certain political narrative, and both sides, left and right, have been guilty. It's gotten so bad that social media companies are trying to combat fake news, but along the way it seems that they reveal their own biases in the process. So yeah, we definitely have some trust issues, and this is the cultural background that we find ourselves living in. In this age of hyper-awareness of bias, Christians have the audacity to say that Jesus is alive and that we actually have good historical evidence to prove it. But these reports are mostly from Christian sources. They're not dispassionate, disinterested parties. They're very much skewed in favor for the faith. Does this mean that the Gospels are unreliable? Well, the first thing that we have to realize is that bias doesn't necessarily require distortion. In fact, often bias motivates someone to take very special care with the truth. Take, for example, the Sandy Hook school shooting. You have Alex Jones and InfoWars claiming that the shooting never happened. At least, according to Jones, it's just some vast anti-gun rights conspiracy. Survivors have become victims of harassment by people who have fallen for this far-out stuff. They've become very passionate to expose what actually happened that tragic day. In this case, personal bias encourages historical accuracy. Now, think for a second about what the gospel writers were reporting. Claiming that a crucified Jewish guy is alive and is also God on top of that wasn't all that popular. It was getting people killed. This was happening while they were writing their accounts. They knew that the bias of the world around them would be very much against their claims. They could have watered down their statements and became more culturally acceptable rather than expose themselves and other believers to harm, yet they didn't. In fact, we have Luke who indicates that it was his bias that drove him to be more accurate. In Luke's prologue, he writes, "Inasmuch as many have undertaken to compile a narrative of the things that have been accomplished among us, just as those who from the beginning were eyewitnesses and ministers of the word have delivered them to us, it seemed good to me also, having followed all things closely for some time past, to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, that you may have certainty concerning the things that you have been taught." Now, the other thing that we have to realize about bias is that if we are rejecting all biased writers, we're undermining almost all of history. We don't throw out Tacitus because he wrote from a Roman bias. We don't junk Josephus because he wrote from a Jewish bias. And we don't even discard Robert E. Lee's memoirs because he wrote from a Confederate bias. That's just not how we do history. Sure, we need to keep bias in mind and understand that it can color what's been reported, but a good historian will try and see past biases and sort out what's fact from distortion. That's what good historical critical methods are set in place for. This is why even skeptical critics still use the gospel as a primary source for the historical Jesus. They recognize that the gospel writers are biased, but they can sift through the accounts and generally they agree upon several facts on the life of Jesus. Here's just a few. John the Baptist baptized Jesus. Jesus was considered to be an exorcist and miracle worker. Jesus had 12 disciples. He taught in parables. The Romans crucified him. The disciples had resurrection experiences after his death, and that the disciples went from cowering in fear to boldly proclaiming resurrection. Now, they might reject miracle stories, but ironically, that's often due to their own naturalistic bias. Now, think about modern reporting for a second. Breitbart and the Daily Kos publish news stories. They both have glaringly obvious biases. Yeah, that doesn't mean that neither aren't reporting the facts at all, ever. You might have to be extra cautious what you read there, but unless you're hyper-partisan, you don't ratchet up your level of skepticism to the nth degree. Now, the other thing that we have to realize about bias is that Saul of Tarsus had a very big bias against Christians, yet he changed. Saul the Pharisee was not a fan at all of Christianity. He agreed that Stephen had it coming to him when he was martyred for the faith. He persecuted Christians. But later he encountered the risen Jesus and his bias changed. He became better known as Paul the Apostle of Jesus. We need to remember that Paul wasn't separated from the events like we are. He didn't have access to documents, but living people. He could have talked with the priest that plotted to have him executed. He was a student under Gamaliel, who was on the Sanhedrin. He had heard all the proofs that Jesus was a deceiver of the people. Apart from his own encounter with Jesus, Paul had full access to the others who claimed they saw Jesus after his death. He could interview them. He could hear from those who followed Jesus up close himself. And we know he met with Peter, James, and John to cross-check his own message. He was definitely in the time and place to sift fact from fiction. This is exactly the type of source that we want when we're looking to sort out the facts from fake news. And we absolutely have it in Paul. This is really the kind of information that historians normally would drool over. So while we say that this is the age of fake news, it's sort of strange that we only tend to follow the sources that confirm our own biases. We all know that person who shares a few too many memes from Occupy Democrats or that latest epic Ben Shapiro roast. Groupthink tends to prevail in packs. The same goes for matters of faith. We need to point out to our skeptical friends that they need to consider their own bias. If God exists, would that be acceptable to them? If Christianity is true, would they be willing to believe it? Are they open to being wrong? If we start from a stubborn place of disbelief, then we're always going to seek out the experts that just confirm our own bias. Now that sword definitely can cut both ways. Christians can be guilty of this too. We need to listen to the best arguments from both sides. But let's stop assuming that bias equals distortion of the truth. In fact, our own bias can prevent us from seeing it ourselves.